Interview 1. Psychological evaluation of subject 4, Dr. Edward Richtofen. Interview begin. I have instructed the patient to remain silent throughout the interview process. The depth of your entangled personality makes you a difficult candidate to dissect. I understand that you adhere to your duties with ruthless conviction, but under the most testing of times, we all crack. You seem to believe that you are an impenetrable wall unto which we may never fathom a peek at the truths in your mind. This wall, however, no longer remains. You see, the web of lies you spin leads us to one solitary understanding. You are who you say you are. A liar? Perhaps not. However, some would say that withholding certain elements of truth is just as disgusting a trait. The whole time you have never admitted to a single thing, at least not knowingly. We will now begin a Rorschach test. Card number 1. Edward, what do you see when you look into her eyes? A young, vulnerable woman, placed in the invidious position of working amongst a group of arrogant men, hell-bent on their own obsessions with the perverse. Or perhaps you see your first real victim. We know what you did to her, Edward. We even know your thought process. You couldn't stand it, could you, Edward? Seeing Ludwig excel in his work, leaving you behind. You saw her as an easy target, didn't you, Edward? She was an attractive young woman, to say the least. Yet all you saw was a lump of meat. And once you had your way, that was all that was left. We understand that you were stationed at Wittenau Sanatorium. I know that you may believe that your research at Wittenau is buried in the dust. It was in fact Dempsey who sparked a link in an almost incomprehensible confession. He confessed the following, and I quote, "I'm sure I've seen Richtofen before all this. He's got something to do with this, but I just can't remember." There is a reason he can't remember, isn't there, Edward? There is a reason that none of your associates can remember a thing. You see, I know what you did to your victims in your chair. I find it unusual that you would trade a pick for a drill. However, I assume that you are coining your own style. Your lobotomy victims surround you in other interrogation rooms. In due course, they will give us the evidence we need. You couldn't stand it, could you, Edward? The idea that they were trying to steal your research, Peter and Dempsey. They knew what you were doing. However, Cornelius did not quite understand the full extent of your research, and so Dempsey was subjected to your chair. I believe that it was you, Edward, you that cut off Peter's arm when he was trying to save his friend. You that stripped him of his findings before subjecting him to what you believed to be a certain death. We move on to card number 2. This card represents both of you. You, Edward, and the other Edward. This may be a hard hand to hold, but it is important that you understand the definitions. I know, Edward, how you work, leaving yourself notes, sordid instructions. For years, we believed you to be separate entities. We now fully understand your being. He tested you, tempted you with the ideals and promises of the Brotherhood of 935. It was enough to push anyone to break. However, you went above and beyond to fulfill your desires. It didn't work, though, did it? Your trap. It failed, Edward. They moved forwards, Edward. 114 and 110 fused nuclei and sent them forwards. Card number 3. Your passion, Edward, other than cold-blooded murder. Inventing. Some of your inventions still find their way into hands of the most elite defense teams available. It must be difficult knowing that you were never given credit for your work. I suppose that Maxis needed to keep the funding involved by showing his creations. We move on to the final card, card number 4. I know of the horrors that your group committed in Berlin, Edward. The atrocities of non-cooperation. You fill an arena full of prospective candidates, lock the doors. Those who join live, the rest suffer excruciating ends. The group. You were a late addition to the group. Maxis was culling his way through the ranks for years before your arrival. Little did you know exactly what absolving yourself of ethics would mean. I do not believe that you always had this in you, Edward. The rage, the fear, the temper. I believe the group designed you to be exactly how you are. You, Edward, are surprisingly not the most damaged of our patients. It is you who I feel the most pity for. Your life, a symbol of esoteric misplacement and horrendous choices and consequences. Psychological evaluation of Subject 4, Dr. Edward Richtofen, complete. End. You do not scare me, Edward. You are no more a stain, a blight on this world. Any man who dares to put your light out is a friend of humanity. Or at least what is left of humanity.